Bayezid I, known as Yildirim the Thunderbolt, turned the early Ottoman state into a force that moved faster than its neighbors could react. He came to the throne in 1389 after the death of his father Murad I at Kosovo, and from the beginning he ruled like a man determined to prove that hesitation was a weakness only the dead had time to afford. He removed rivals inside his own family. He crushed Anatolian beyliks one after another. He forced smaller rulers into submission and made the Ottoman court look less like a frontier principality and more like an empire that had learned how to bite. By the 1390s, his power had spread across the Balkans and deep into Anatolia, and he had begun the siege of Constantinople, tightening pressure on the city that had survived nearly everything except time. His most famous victory came at Nicopolis in 1396, where a crusading army from Europe came to break Ottoman expansion and was destroyed instead. The defeat stunned Christendom and made Bayezid's name feared across the continent. Prisoners were taken, some were ransomed, others were not. The message of his reign was always the same. If you resisted, you would be made into an example. Bayezid did not simply win wars. He made defeat look permanent. He made enemies disappear before they could become problems. He believed speed was the same thing as destiny, and for a while, that belief seemed correct. Then Timur appeared. Bayezid had expanded too quickly, swallowed too much, and made too many enemies in too many directions. Timur, who tolerated no rival he could not humiliate, met him at Ankara in 1402. The battle was a catastrophe. Bayezid's forces collapsed. Some of his allies defected. The Thunderbolt was captured alive, and the ruler, who had spent years breaking others, became a trophy in the hands of another conqueror. Later stories would embellish his humiliation, but the core fact is enough. He was defeated so completely that the empire around him began to come apart before he had even died. Bayezid died in 1403 while still in captivity, probably of illness, though the exact cause is uncertain. His sons immediately fought over the throne, and the Ottoman state fell in a civil war that lasted more than a decade. Tughril Beg transformed the Seljuks from a wandering Turkic clan into the dominant power of the Islamic world. Before Tughril, the Seljuks were one tribal force among many moving across Central Asia. By the time of his death in 1063, he had conquered Persia, entered Baghdad as a victor, and broken the power of the dynasties that had controlled the Abbasid Caliph. He ruled through cavalry, speed, and relentless expansion, turning the Seljuks into the military protectors of Sunni Islam. In 1055, Tughril entered Baghdad after defeating the Buyids, the Persian dynasty that had dominated the weakened Abbasid Caliphate for decades. The Caliph welcomed him as a savior and granted him titles recognizing him as ruler of the East and West. But Tughril's empire was held together less by administration than by force. Cities that resisted him were subdued. Rivals were removed. Former allies became enemies as the empire expanded faster than loyalty could keep pace. Tughril had built a state powerful enough to dominate the region, but fragile enough that everyone understood his death would test whether it could survive him. He died in 1063 near Rey after falling ill during the final years of constant campaigning and political struggle. The exact cause remains uncertain. What followed was a succession crisis among competing Seljuk claimants, the same danger that had haunted nearly every steppe empire before it. Tughril had conquered an empire large enough to reshape the Islamic world. Firoz Shah Tughlaq ruled the Delhi Sultanate from 1351 to 1388, inheriting an empire already weakened by rebellions, famine, and the disastrous experiments of his predecessor, Muhammad bin Tughluq. Unlike the rulers who expanded the Sultanate through constant conquest, Firoz focused on control, religious enforcement, and punishment. He rebuilt canals, founded cities, and repaired monuments, but he also transformed the Delhi Sultanate into a far more openly intolerant Islamic state than it had been under many earlier sultans. Firoz expanded the use of Islamic law across the empire and enforced jizya taxes more aggressively against non-Muslims, including Brahmins who had previously often been exempt. He ordered temples destroyed during campaigns and recorded several of the demolitions proudly in his own memoirs, the Futuhat-i Firoz Shahi. Slavery expanded enormously under his reign. Contemporary chronicler Shams Siraj Afif claimed Firoz maintained nearly 180,000 slaves under state control. Many were prisoners taken during military expeditions. Others were forced into labor serving the court, army, and royal workshops. Punishments under his government included mutilation, amputations, and public executions carried out as demonstrations of authority. Yet the empire beneath him continued weakening. Provincial governors became increasingly independent. The military lost much of the aggressive strength it had possessed under earlier Delhi sultans. Firoz preferred preserving authority to testing it in dangerous campaigns, and by the final years of his reign, the Sultanate depended heavily on aging structures that were already beginning to crack. When he died in 1388 at about 79 years old, probably from natural causes, the struggle for succession began almost immediately. Within a decade, the Delhi Sultanate collapsed into chaos severe enough that Timur's invasion of India in 1398 shattered much of what remained. Murad IV became Ottoman Sultan in 1623 at the age of 11, inheriting an empire collapsing into rebellion, corruption, and near anarchy. Provincial revolts spread across Anatolia. Janissary factions dominated the capital. Assassinations and mutinies had turned the Ottoman court into a place where sultans could be controlled or removed by their own soldiers. Murad grew up surrounded by instability, and when he finally seized real power for himself, he ruled with a level of fear the empire had not seen in generations. He restored authority through executions, terror, and absolute discipline. Officials suspected of corruption were strangled. Janissaries who challenged him were killed. Istanbul became a city where people disappeared for violating the Sultan's orders. Murad personally enforced bans on alcohol, tobacco, and coffee, believing they encouraged disorder and political conspiracy. According to Ottoman chroniclers, he sometimes disguised himself at night and walked through the streets carrying weapons, executing violators on the spot. Coffee houses were destroyed because they functioned as gathering places where criticism of the government could spread. Under Murad, fear became state policy. In 1638, he achieved his greatest military success by recapturing Baghdad from the Safavid Empire after a brutal siege that killed thousands. The victory restored Ottoman prestige after years of humiliation and rebellion, and Murad was celebrated as the ruler who had finally reimposed order on a collapsing empire. But the discipline he created depended almost entirely on his personal violence. The stability of the empire rested on the fact that everyone feared the Sultan himself. Once that fear disappeared, the system beneath it remained fragile. Years of heavy drinking damaged Murad's health despite the prohibitions he imposed on everyone else. He died in 1640 at just 27 years old, most likely from cirrhosis or complications related to alcoholism. Before his death, he reportedly ordered the execution of his own brothers to prevent another succession crisis, though at least one survived and became Sultan Ibrahim. Muhammad bin Tughluq ruled the Delhi Sultanate from 1325 to 1351 and remains one of the most intelligent and catastrophic rulers in medieval Indian history. Contemporary chroniclers described him as brilliant, educated, and dangerously unpredictable. He spoke multiple languages, studied philosophy and mathematics, and imagined an empire far larger and more centralized than the Delhi Sultanate had ever been before. He also governed through experiments so destructive that entire regions of his empire collapsed under the pressure. His reign became infamous for policies that seemed visionary in theory and disastrous in practice. He ordered the capital moved from Delhi to Dawlatabad deep in the Deccan, forcing nobles, scholars, merchants, and entire families to march hundreds of kilometers across India. Many died during the relocation from exhaustion, starvation, and disease. Years later, he reversed the decision and ordered people back again. He introduced token copper currency meant to function like silver coinage, but the state lacked the ability to control counterfeiting. Ordinary people began producing false coins in their homes until the economy nearly disintegrated under worthless money. Muhammad also imposed crushing taxation in the Doab region between the Ganges and Yamuna rivers during a period of famine. Peasants abandoned villages. Rebellions spread constantly across the Sultanate. Chronicler Ziauddin Barani wrote that the empire became trapped in endless cycles of revolt and punishment. Muhammad responded with brutal military repression, mass executions, and campaigns against rebellious provinces that drained the treasury further. The Sultan spent much of his reign marching armies from one collapsing frontier to another, trying to hold together an empire already breaking apart beneath him. He died in 1351 while campaigning against rebels in Sindh, probably from illness or fever after decades of constant war and political exhaustion. By the time of his death, much of the empire had fragmented into semi-independent states beyond Delhi's real control. Baibars rose from slavery to become the most feared ruler of the Mamluk Sultanate and the man who halted both the Mongols and the Crusaders within a single generation. Born somewhere on the Eurasian steppe in the early 13th century, he was captured as a child and sold into slavery before eventually entering the Mamluk military system in Egypt. By the time he seized the throne in 1260, the Islamic world was collapsing under external invasion. Baghdad had fallen to the Mongols. Crusader states still controlled parts of the Levant. Entire dynasties were disappearing. Baibars built his rule in the middle of that chaos through military brilliance, political violence, and calculated terror. His greatest victory came at Ain Jalut in 1260, where the Mamluks defeated a Mongol army for the first major Mongol defeat in open battle. The victory transformed Baibars into a defender of the Islamic world, but he ruled less like a savior than a man convinced fear was necessary for survival. Rival emirs were eliminated. Suspected conspirators disappeared. Cities resisting Mamluk authority were punished harshly. Baibars launched repeated campaigns against Crusader strongholds across the Levant, capturing cities through siege, massacre, and intimidation. At Antioch in 1268, one of the oldest Crusader states, was destroyed so completely that contemporary Muslim chroniclers described the streets as filled with corpses and captives. He also built an enormous intelligence and courier network across his empire, allowing information and military orders to travel with unusual speed for the medieval world. But the state he created depended heavily on his personal authority. Baibars ruled through military loyalty backed by constant displays of force, and the court around him became a place where power changed hands through assassination as often as succession. The Sultan who had risen from slavery understood better than most rulers how quickly powerful men could become dead men. In 1277, after years of near-continuous campaigning, Baibars died suddenly near Damascus at about 54 years old. Most accounts say he accidentally drank poisoned kumis intended for someone else during a celebration after one of his victories. Other versions claim illness or deliberate poisoning. The exact truth remains uncertain. Mahmud of Ghazni transformed the Ghaznavid Empire from a regional Central Asian kingdom into one of the most feared military powers of the 11th century. He ruled from 998 to 1030 and spent much of his reign campaigning almost continuously across Persia, Central Asia, and northern India. Mahmud presented himself as a champion of Sunni Islam and a destroyer of idol worship, but his empire was built just as much on plunder, intimidation, and military expansion as on religion. His invasions into the Indian subcontinent became the foundation of his reputation. Medieval Persian chroniclers celebrated him for raiding wealthy temple cities and carrying enormous quantities of treasure back to Ghazni. His most famous campaign came in 1025 against the temple of Somnath in Gujarat. According to later accounts, Mahmud's forces massacred defenders, looted the temple's wealth, and destroyed its sacred idols before returning north with caravans filled with gold, silver, and captives. Whether some of the larger numbers recorded by later chroniclers are exaggerated remains debated, but the scale of the destruction and plunder is not. Mahmud ruled through constant warfare because the Ghaznavid state depended heavily on military success and the wealth conquest produced. Rival dynasties in Central Asia, rebellious governors, and frontier enemies required continuous campaigning to keep the empire together. Ghazni itself became one of the richest cities of the Islamic world under his reign, filled with scholars, poets, libraries, and palaces financed by war. But the empire beneath that wealth remained overstretched and dependent on the personal authority of the Sultan who had created it. By the final years of his reign, decades of campaigning had damaged Mahmud's health. Medieval chroniclers describe periods of illness, exhaustion, and physical decline, while he continued trying to manage a massive empire stretched across difficult terrain and unstable frontiers. He died in April 1030 at Ghazni, probably around the age of 58, most likely from illness compounded by years of warfare and stress. After his death, succession struggles weakened the empire rapidly, and within a generation the Seljuks shattered much of Ghaznavid power in Central Asia. Alauddin Khalji ruled the Delhi Sultanate from 1296 to 1316 and built one of the most militarized and feared governments in medieval Indian history. He seized the throne after assassinating his own uncle and father-in-law, Sultan Jalaluddin Khalji, during what had supposedly been a peaceful meeting on the banks of the Ganges. From the beginning, Alauddin ruled as a man convinced that mercy created conspiracies and that fear was the only reliable form of stability. He expanded the Delhi Sultanate through relentless warfare across northern and central India. His generals conquered Gujarat, Ranthambore, Chittor, and large parts of the Deccan. Massive quantities of treasure, slaves, and war captives flowed back into Delhi. Alauddin also repelled repeated Mongol invasions that threatened to break the Sultanate entirely, and after surviving those attacks, he transformed his government into an empire built around surveillance, military control, and economic regulation. Nobles were forbidden from forming private alliances or holding lavish gatherings. Spies operated throughout the court and markets. Wealthy elites were watched constantly because Alauddin believed rebellion began wherever powerful men had enough comfort to think freely. His rule became infamous for harsh punishments and heavy taxation. Peasants in fertile agricultural regions were taxed so aggressively that contemporary chroniclers described entire populations reduced to near subsistence. By the final years of his reign, Alauddin's health deteriorated severely. He died in January 1316, probably around the age of 49, most likely from disease complicated by years of stress and excess. Selim I, known as Yavuz the Grim, ruled the Ottoman Empire from 1512 to 1520 and transformed it into the dominant power of the Islamic world through conquest, execution, and religious war. He came to the throne after overthrowing his own father, Bayezid Datun, during a brutal succession struggle that ended with Bayezid dying in exile only weeks later. Selim understood Ottoman politics the way many early sultans did. A throne divided between brothers was a throne already collapsing. Once in power, he moved quickly against rival princes and ordered the execution of potential claimants before they could organize resistance. His reign was short but extraordinarily violent. Selim turned first against the Safavid Empire of Persia, whose Shia ideology he considered both a political threat and a religious enemy. Before marching east, he ordered mass persecutions against suspected Safavid sympathizers within Anatolia. Contemporary sources describe thousands executed or imprisoned. In 1514, he defeated Shah Ismail at the Battle of Chaldiran, using Ottoman artillery and firearms against Safavid cavalry. The victory shattered Safavid momentum and established the Ottomans as the strongest Sunni military power in the region. Selim then turned south against the Mamluk Sultanate, one of the oldest powers in the Islamic world. In two campaigns between 1516 and 1517, the Ottomans destroyed the Mamluk state completely. Syria, Egypt, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina passed under Ottoman control. The last Abbasid caliph in Cairo was absorbed into Ottoman authority, and later Ottoman tradition would portray Selim as inheriting the leadership of the Sunni Islamic world itself. The empire expanded faster under Selim than under almost any previous Ottoman ruler, but his court ruled through fear as much as victory. Executions of officials, rivals, and suspected traitors became common, and many around him believed the Sultan trusted almost no one completely. In 1520, after only 8 years on the throne, Selim fell seriously ill while preparing another military campaign, possibly against Hungary or Persia. Most historians believe he died from cancer or a severe skin infection, though the exact cause remains uncertain. He died near Constantinople at about 49 years old. Aurangzeb ruled the Mughal Empire from 1658 to 1707 and expanded it to its greatest territorial size through nearly constant warfare, religious enforcement, and political repression. He came to power after one of the bloodiest succession struggles in Mughal history, defeating his brothers in a civil war that shattered the imperial court. His brother Darish Shikoh, the favored heir of their father Shah Jahan, was captured, paraded through Delhi in chains, and executed on Aurangzeb's orders in 1659. Their father spent the final years of his life imprisoned inside Agra fort by the son who had taken his throne. Unlike earlier Mughal rulers who balanced imperial authority with relative religious flexibility, Aurangzeb governed with a far stricter interpretation of Islamic law. He reimposed the jizya tax on non-Muslims, enforced religious restrictions more aggressively, and ordered the destruction of several Hindu temples during campaigns against rebellious regions and political enemies. His long wars in the Deccan against the Marathas, Bijapur, and Golconda consumed enormous amounts of wealth, manpower, and time. Entire regions were devastated by taxation, sieges, famine, and continuous military movement as the empire stretched deeper into southern India than any Mughal ruler had attempted before. Aurangzeb ruled through discipline and suspicion. Court music was restricted. Luxuries associated with earlier Mughal emperors were reduced. Nobles and governors were watched carefully because rebellion became a constant feature of the empire during his reign. Sikhs, Marathas, Rajputs, and Deccan powers all fought prolonged conflicts against Mughal authority at different stages of his rule. The empire continued expanding outward, but beneath the expansion, the imperial system was becoming exhausted. The Mughal state depended increasingly on military force to maintain territories too large to govern efficiently from the center. By the final years of his reign, Aurangzeb was an old man still leading campaigns from military camps deep in the Deccan after decades of war. Contemporary letters written near the end of his life describe exhaustion, regret, and awareness that the empire around him was becoming unstable despite its enormous size. He died in 1707 at about 88 years old, most likely from illness and physical decline after nearly half a century on the throne. Within decades of his death, the Mughal Empire began fragmenting under regional revolts, invasions, and internal weakness. Aurangzeb had expanded the empire further than any Mughal emperor before him, but the wars and policies that created that expansion also helped drain the strength that had once held the empire together. The ruler who conquered most of India left behind an empire too vast, too divided, and too exhausted to survive his legacy intact.